Hey there everyone, and welcome to Midweek Update number 2. Shockingly, I've actually managed to keep on schedule for an entire 2 updates in a row now. You guys think I can keep the streak up? Unfortunately, once again, I didn't quite get as much raw level design done as I would have liked. The past week was relatively rough for me in terms of personal life issues, and additionally I got distracted with more polish-oriented and bug-fixing oriented aspects of the game's design. Thankfully though, that means I've got a bunch of those things to show off today. The main progression of the level I've done pretty much exclusively consists of this one vine used to climb up to the next level of the base itself. Catboy will need to hop from leaf to leaf and proceed upwards, having much more of the exterior of the base open to him now that he's reached a good vantage point. This is where the first polish feature I mentioned occurs. As you've probably noticed, when Catboy lands on a leaf, it slightly sinks downwards, giving more weight to his movement. There are 2 more cool things about this. Firstly, the system itself is dynamic, meaning that I'll be able to make any other potential bouncy objects, the leaves of the Fightyplace trees perhaps, use this system extremely easily. Additionally, in order to get this to work properly without a whole lot of jittering and jank, I had to set up the framework for moving platforms. This means that whenever I do get around to adding moving platforms, they'll be extremely easy to do. On the topic of jittering and jank, the major bug/polishing improvement I spent a lot of time wrestling with was what happens to Catboy when he hits a ceiling. This proved to be a surprisingly difficult issue to tackle, but in the end I managed to get it into a mostly satisfactory state. I'll show you guys what happened. Up until last week, Catboy used a system that basically said, if you hit a ceiling, you'll stop moving upwards entirely. Otherwise, he'd just sort of freeze in the air for a second like you can see here. This worked fantastically well for flat ceilings, but as you can see, quite a bit less well for sloped things. While it may sometimes make physical sense for Catboy to stop moving upwards if he hits any sort of ceiling at all, it doesn't play very well, and sometimes the game thinks something is a ceiling when, in reality, it's just an extremely slightly bent wall. This issue grew to be especially noticeable with ledge hanging, where Catboy would just sort of drop off the ledge sometimes when he tried to jump, so I ended up deciding that it needed to change. What I did was I changed it so that Catboy's movement would simply get flattened out against the surface he hit. It seemed usable up until I started recording last week's midweek update. 2 major issues started happening. The first was that Catboy suddenly became unable to pull himself up onto ledges without a lot of finagling and air kicking, as you can actually see in this clip from last week's midweek update. And the second was that when hitting ceilings at high speeds, he'd actually end up rocketing sideways into the distance, neither of which were very fun or consistent to play with. So I changed it again this week, by removing momentum from the equation and only checking it when he was near the peak of his jump. Both of the aforementioned problems were fixed. However, several problems arose yet again, primarily concerning inconsistencies with this reverse sliding. Some slopes would cause him to jitter uncontrollably, making the game just feel kinda gross. And others simply just wouldn't slide him at all, even though they should, and it'd behave like the original one where he just stopped moving. Though it was workable for the most part, I decided I still wasn't satisfied with it. After a couple of tweaks to the code, I finally got it into a mostly smooth and acceptable state. I'm very likely going to come back and iron it out some more by the time of release, but for now I'm very happy with how it's ended up. Progressing further down the mountain, I've improved the area where the cannons are hitting quite a bit. A number of changes have been made to the cannonballs themselves. I've rewritten their code to prevent them from going through objects. That was a huge pain in the ass. I've increased their size to make them more visible, and I've assigned them the Shamrock Barrel explosion effect. I'll likely make a unique one for them in the future, but for now I was happy just doing this for a more impressive explosion. Additionally, I've littered the ground below with some scorch marks and craters, and the scorch marks are very placeholder. Don't worry, that is not a finalized texture whatsoever. I'm sure someone's gonna still think it is, though. But the point is, I did that in order to make it feel a little bit more like a landscape that's actually being pelted with explosions every hour of every day, constantly forever. The tweaks to the cannonball hit detection also apply to the cannoneers shots. This is what was really the big pain. But that means that fighting them should feel a lot more consistent than it did before. Now let's move over here and talk about this work-in-progress tower for a moment. One of the first structures built by the Shamrocks of the Fightyplace, this tower had a protective magical shield placed over it by an ancient Shamrock sage. Though the shield kept it from being destroyed by Sphere Friend weaponry, the magic proved so powerful that even the Sage couldn't undo the spell. This left the tower completely sealed and inaccessible, causing a strong amount of magical energy to begin to percolate inside. Very interesting, but we're gonna have to leave more information on it for a future update. Moving down below, there's another work in progress area that I'd like to show off briefly. Soon enough, there will be an artillery cannon built into the base of this pillar. Catboy will need to climb up around back here and find a way to disable it within this cave. Obviously, there's nothing here yet, so the reason I'm showing this off is actually a different thing, a brand new improvement I made to the PTO system I mentioned in the last video. As you can see, I figured out how to set it up so that when inside of cramped interiors, the camera's actually able to fade only the outside and make the exterior transparent, but keep the inside completely opaque and visible, and also have a nice black background masking over the areas that would otherwise just be a weird, ugly, transparent X-ray. That's about all there is to say about it, but I'm just really excited to see what else I'll be able to do with this element of the PTO system, and really just the PTO system in the future. Finally, I've made two major improvements to Catboy's movement. The first is that I've substantially increased his aerial mobility. It's nearly double what it used to be. This makes him much more enjoyable and fun to control. The reason it was so low before is that back when I added wall jumping, I realized that with some well-timed air kicks, Catboy could actually climb any wall in the game indefinitely. While I love the crazy tricks some people learn how to do in platformers for speedruns and stuff, this was far too easy and far too powerful for me to just leave it in, so the band-aid fix I made back then was to simply reduce Catboy's aerial mobility. The reason I bring this up is that in order to properly fix this issue, I had to implement something else with his platforming this week. I can now make certain moves reduce the player's control of Catboy briefly and adjust how long it takes for said control to come back. Essentially, this lets me reduce his mobility during certain animations and in certain cases, like with wall jumping or high jumping, and this will still let the player usually have much nicer control over Catboy's actual movement when he's not doing these special moves. Due to how briefly these lower control periods last, there's also no sense of inconsistency to his movement as far as I've been able to test. Like, even though, removing control from the player is usually bad and makes things inconsistent, I feel like I've handled it pretty well here. So, overall, that's about it for this week. Next up on the agenda is, like it has been for the past few months, working on the level design of the Fightyplace. Knowing me, there will likely also be a lot of polishing and side work done as well, and that'll end up taking dev time away from the level geometry, but who knows what'll happen. Maybe I'll finally manage to get everything done. We'll just have to see next Wednesday. As always, you can check out the description for more links to help out with the game and keep up with the development of the game, and you can also subscribe to stay tuned to the bulk of the game's development via these future midweek updates. Thanks for watching, everyone, and I'll catch you guys next week.